welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akiri. The headlines. Russian President Vladimir Putin issues fresh warning over Finland and Sweden's bids to join NATO, warns that Russia will respond in kind to any threats. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky asks NATO alliance to do more to help his country resist the Russian invasion. And UK government pledges an extra £1 billion in military support for Ukraine. We start from news that NATO has formally invited Finland and Sweden to join the military alliance during the summit in Madrid, Spain. However, Russian President Vladimir Putin has now issued a fresh warning that Russia would respond in kind if NATO deployed troops and infrastructure in Finland and Sweden after they joined the US-led military alliance. He made the comments after talks with regional leaders in the ex-Soviet state of Turkmenistan. He said it was inevitable that Moscow's relations with Helsinki and Stockholm would sour over their NATO membership.
In regard to Finland and Sweden, we don't have problems with Finland and Sweden that unfortunately we have with Ukraine. We have no territorial disputes with them. There's nothing that might concern us in terms of Finland and Sweden becoming NATO members. If they want to, please go ahead. But they should clearly understand that they didn't face any threats before this. Now, if NATO troops and infrastructure are deployed, we will be compelled to respond in kind and creates the same threats for the territories from which threats towards us are created. It's obvious. What don't they understand? Everything was going fine between us, but now there will be tensions. There certainly will. This is obvious and inevitable. I repeat, if there is a threat to us.
The Russian leader also denied that Moscow's forces were responsible for a missile raid on a crowded shopping mall in the Ukrainian town of Kremenchuk earlier this week, in which at least 18 people were killed and many remain missing in the rubble. Mr. Putin told the same news conference in Ashgabat that the army of Russia does not attack any civilian infrastructure sites. Quoting him, "I'm convinced that this time everything was done in this exact manner." Ukraine accuses Russia of targeting the shopping center and civilian shoppers, while Western leaders have condemned the attack, calling it sickening and abominable. At the NATO summit in Madrid, President Volodymyr Zelensky asked the alliance leaders for modern weapons and funds to support Ukraine's fight against Russia's invasion, warning the fighting could spill beyond its borders and into their countries. Mr. Zelensky addressed the 30 leaders of the bloc via video link, where they were set to lay out the alliance's 10-year strategic framework and launch the largest revamp of its defense and deterrence capabilities since the end of the Cold War. He framed the fight as a war for the right to dictate conditions in Europe for what the future world order would be like. Ukrainian officials have continually appealed for more firepower as the Russian invasion, which began on February the 24th, has refocused on the eastern Donbas region. It appears that NATO may have considered President Zelensky's plea for help, as the alliance has agreed to a long-term financial and military aid package to modernize Ukraine's largely Soviet-era military. The alliance's new strategic concept document, its first since the year 2010, said that a strong, independent Ukraine is vital for the stability of the Euro-Atlantic area. The communique reads, "We stand in full solidarity with the government and the people of Ukraine in the heroic defense of their country." In other developments, Russia has continued to shell cities and settlements across Ukraine, stepping up its attacks beyond the Donbas region. President Zelensky said Russian forces struck the town of Ochakiv in the Dnipropetrovsk region, the port city of Mykolaiv, and across the Kharkiv and Sumy regions. He said 10 missiles fell on Mykolaiv yesterday, all aimed at civilian targets. The death toll in Mykolaiv now climbs to 6 after rescue workers found another body in the rubble with another 6, according to emergency services, wounded. And Mr. Zelensky has also said that British entrepreneur Richard Branson was willing to join the post-war reconstruction following his visit to Ukraine. He said Mr. Branson had visited Hostomel Airport in the Kyiv region and discussed the possibility of rebuilding the airport and building our Miria, the world's largest aircraft. The Ukrainian-made Antonov 225 Miria was burnt in a Russian attack on Hostomel Airport at the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The aircraft can carry up to 250 tons.
One of the most famous businessmen in the world, Richard Branson, also visited Ukraine. He is more than just an entrepreneur. He is a visionary, a man who works for progress and the best technology for all mankind. His arrival to Ukraine right now, and he visited Hostomel, where he discussed in particular the possibility of rebuilding the airport and building our Miria, the world's largest aircraft. It's a very strong signal to everyone in the world that Ukraine will stand up in this war. And I am grateful to Mr. Branson for his willingness to join the post-war reconstruction of our country. For the first time in all the years of independence, the president of Indonesia, a very influential state that may suffer significantly from the food crisis provoked by Russia, paid a visit to Kyiv today. Therefore, these were important negotiations that opened for Ukraine another strategic direction of relations with Asia.
And indeed, Indonesian President Joko Widodo has offered to deliver a message from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to Russian leader Vladimir Putin to try to boost peace hopes. President Widodo, also known as Jokowi, met with Mr. Zelensky with hopes of rekindling peace talks between Russia and Ukraine and exploring ways to free up exports of grain to global markets. He also confirmed Indonesia's contribution to medical and infrastructure aid to Kyiv. Jokowi, who arrived in Kyiv from Poland by train on Wednesday morning, repeated an invitation from Mr. Zelensky to attend a G20 leaders summit in Indonesia's Bali in November. The UK will provide an additional £1 billion in military aid for Ukraine, a near doubling in its support for the fight against Russian invasion. The new funding takes the military aid given to Kyiv so far to £2.3 billion, and the UK has also spent £1.5 billion in humanitarian and economic support for Ukraine. Boris Johnson says British spending was transforming Ukraine's defenses. The pledge came after President Zelensky urged NATO leaders to do more to help Ukraine's war efforts. Mr. Zelensky told NATO leaders the monthly cost of defense for Ukraine was around $5 billion. The UK is second only to the US in terms of military aid for Ukraine. The US recently approved a $40 billion package of support. In the meantime, hundreds of Ukrainian troops have completed military training in Britain, including on the multiple launch rocket systems the British government is supplying to help counter Russian artillery tactics. Ukrainian troops were filmed earlier this week loading and firing the 105mm light guns during exercises in Salisbury, England, one part of a British-led program that has been undertaken by more than 450 Ukrainian armed forces with support from New Zealand. MLR systems were also shown in use. The training is part of a wide-ranging international support package following Russia's invasion earlier this year, as the West seeks to help Ukraine repel Russian forces by providing increasingly advanced weapon systems and the skills to use them.
Makes them a pleasure to teach. They are extremely keen to learn, and we have had them for long days. We've been teaching them from 8 in the morning till 6 at night, 7 days a week for the whole period that they've been here. Their appetite at the beginning was, as you can imagine, extremely high and very needy, but as they've become more attuned and accustomed to being able to operate this system, that's started to calm down, and they're now in a position where the battery commander himself is now exercising his troops under his own doctrine and tactics, and we're able to take a step back and just be there for safety in a coaching and mentoring stance. Yes, we've had them for nearly 3 weeks now. They arrived at very short notice. A mixture of the trained audience consisted of logisticians, maintainers, operators and command post officers, and we've put them through a modulated programme to not only train them on this system, but how to plan and prepare its deployment to. At the end of the day, it's another component to their orbit, and it's a force multiplier. Because it's a tracked vehicle, their rocket systems are wheeled. It's going to give them more mobility, which is going to aid in their survivability. And naturally, it's an ammunition that's able to punch out to 84 kilometres.
Let's talk to the Executive Director, Pekivi Consulting Limited in the United Kingdom, Mr. Chidi Won, who joins us from the British capital. Good morning to you. Thank you for your time.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
Let's start from what we just saw, the British training Ukrainian troops in the use of MLRS systems, amongst others. This was part of something that Boris Johnson had indicated when he last visited Kiev just before the by-elections in the UK earlier on this month. Do you think this is going to be mark a significant change in the fortunes of the Ukrainian forces, especially when taken together with what NATO has now pledged to also do?
So in the short term, it will not be that much of a game changer. So we've got to factor in. So in that clip that was just played, you can see two weapon systems. The first was the 105 gun, which is a fairly old gun with, I mean, it's not short range, but it's not, you know, it doesn't outrange many Russian artillery pieces, but it's still a very effective weapon system. And the HIMARS, which again is a really effective weapon system and has a good range, and depending on what ammunition is supplied with it, again, has a good kind of extent of capability. But what it's not going to do in the short term is change Ukraine's fortunes. Right now, they're losing the Battle of Donbass. Luhansk is falling. Ivichenko will most likely fall this week. I mean, it's being abandoned. So it still leaves them with Donetsk, but it doesn't really, you know, give them that many options in terms of how they're going to counter this. So no, in the short term, it won't change the reality. The Russians also have, this has been very widely advertised. It's not a secret capability. The Russians already knew about this weapon system and obviously have devised countermeasures for it. So it's not like it's suddenly going to appear and the Russians will be shocked and surprised. They're waiting for it, they're expecting it. So they'll be hunting these weapon systems from the point of delivery to the point of deployment and trying to destroy them. But in the long term, I mean, what's very important is what was said in that clip about, you know, the battery commander is now training his troops in using his own tactics and doctrine. The Ukrainians have been fighting this war for almost 3 months now. They're very well versed with Russian tactics, with Russian skills. When they incorporate these weapon systems into their own systems, and they've got very effective fire control systems, they should be able to start giving serious, you know, damage to the Russians and countering some of their artillery fire. But that's how it's used is the important thing. Is it going to be used defensively to hold the ground further and prevent the Russians from taking more of the Donbass region? Or will it be used offensively to support a counterattack? So all of these are the factors that we need to weigh up before we can actually say what the effect is going to be on the battlefield.
It does look, of course, that the Western allies are not backing down. All the pledges that have been made in support of Ukraine remain. NATO is producing, or has just produced, a new strategic document that specifically talks about strengthening Ukraine. It will probably be the first time that NATO would be talking specifically about one country in its strategy policy documents in a very, very long time after the Soviet Union was dissolved. And then you have now the Russian leader telling Finland and Sweden that it is they who have introduced tension into the relationships between them by joining or by seeking to join NATO. How do you see all of this working out? Do you think that it is possible that if Finland and Sweden join NATO, that could create the kind of situation that is already happening now between Russia and Ukraine in those two other countries?
So no, I mean, it's this is a fascinating thing about this war, in that it's been framed from the Russian side as a defensive war to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. However, Ukraine could never have joined NATO because it had contested territory with Russia, with Crimea that had been annexed, and it also had the internal war in Donbass. So that prevented Ukraine from joining NATO. So in essence, on February the 24th, Russia had the perfect situation. It had Ukraine on its border, which was embroiled in a frozen conflict, could never join NATO. It had Sweden and Finland, who were on its Baltic front, two very powerful warlike nations with strong economies and strong military-industrial bases, who had also were neutral, were avowedly neutral. They weren't joining NATO. They were not joining any alliance. They were just staying in their own corner. And now, a few months later, you have Ukraine that has absorbed a huge proportion of Russia's military power, and Finland and Sweden joining NATO. It's, from a strategic point of view, it's a disaster. It means that if a war does come, Article 5 is triggered. Russia is bottled up to the north, as well as having the very capable militaries of Finland and Sweden to deal with. From a Russian planning point of view, it means you can't just allocate and right now they've got to allocate forces not only to the war in Ukraine, but they've also got to keep forces in reserve in case there's a conflict with NATO, and they've got to keep forces in reserve to deal with any other issues maybe in Central Asia, and they've got to keep forces in reserve to deal with any issues that might come up with China. Now they've also got to keep forces in reserve to deal with things that might happen in the high north. Strategically, it's a disaster from the Russian point of view, and it's completely it was completely avoidable. It was directly linked to the invasion of Ukraine. So whilst operationally the Russians are having success, they're capturing territory, they're defeating the Ukrainian army. From a strategic point of view, they have backed themselves into a corner which is going to be very difficult for them to get out of.
Well, there is the elephant in the room, and while all those listening to you or watching you would say, yes, indeed, they appear to have backed themselves into a corner. But two things. The first is that apart from the United States and China, Russia would appear, at least according to the records, to have the largest number of military or personnel under military command, and therefore possibly they could come up with the troops to provide all these reserves, especially since they also use conscription. The second point is that at the very start of the war, Vladimir Putin did point out that if indeed they were backed into a corner by the Western alliance, he would reach for his nuclear weapons. And that gave everybody cause for pause. What has changed?
So there's two really great points there. So in terms of the Russian military strength, there's the elements there is clear for us to see that whilst on paper they had great strength, they had lots of ammunition, they'd gone through lots of equipment, they'd gone through a 14-year modernization program, they brought out some innovative tactics. For those of us watching them in Syria, in Libya, and even in Georgia and Ukraine, we'd seen the step changes and improvements, and we rated the Russian military quite highly. But as we've seen in Ukraine, whilst they tried at the beginning to adopt this maneuverist, approach, that fell short for them. They were soundly defeated in the Battle of Kiev. While they were successful in the south and have become more successful in the east, to become successful in the east, they had to go back to their old tactics of lots of artillery and slow advances. Exactly the same thing that they did in the Second World War. The difference is that in the Second World War, they had a huge population. They had a huge population that they could use, and they could use without, without too much pushback. The majority of the Russian population is centered around two provinces, around St. Petersburg and Moscow, the two most prosperous, the most educated regions. Yet if you look at the casualties coming from Russia, most of them come from the far republics, from the Tatars, from the Siberians, from the Chechens. So whilst the Russians have lots of forces to use, they can't necessarily use the core of their population, because that is the most vocal population. That's where you're going to get a revolt. If you try and recruit people en masse from Moscow or St. Petersburg, that's when you'll get a massive pushback. But if you're from some village in Siberia where you have no choice other than to join the army, that's where you can go. And essentially the Russians are going to run out of Siberians. They have long-term demographic problems in that they unlike maybe in Nigeria where we've got a youth bubble, they actually have an old age bubble. People are dying quicker. They have much lower life expectancy.
Yeah.
So that all of that factors against them, being able to. And the final point on that is that even if you want to do a mass mobilization, that will crash the economy. Part of the problem for Ukraine now is they've done a mass mobilization, meaning they've taken all the men out of their economy and they're all in the army. Their economy is crashing. That's why they need so much support from the West. And the final point on nuclear weapons is, I don't know how to put this. I'll say this in Nigeria, in a Nigerian way. Everybody will chop breakfast. If they're not the only ones that have nuclear weapons. So once you fire one nuclear weapon, everybody's firing back at you, and that's it. So they can threaten as much as they like, but everyone understands how it works. You fire and we fire, and that's it. So nobody worries too much about the nuclear side. It's what we worry about is more the conventional, the conventional battle.
Indeed, Mr. Chidiwanu, thank you for your perspective this morning. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
When we return, Russian forces stormed the Lysychansk oil refinery. Please join us again. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Ukraine has carried out its biggest exchange of prisoners of war since Russia invaded, securing the release of 144 of its soldiers, including 95 who defended Mariupol's steelworks, Ukraine's military intelligence has reported. The majority of the Ukrainians were badly wounded, suffering from gunshot and shrapnel wounds, blast traumas, burns, fractured bones, and amputated limbs. The agency, known by the acronym GER, said in a statement on Telegram. But the head of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic in eastern Ukraine said it had secured the release of the 144 soldiers, including its fighters and those of the Russian army. Hundreds more Ukrainians are still thought to be held by Russia and its pro-Moscow separatist proxies in eastern Ukraine, but their precise whereabouts are not known. The prisoner swap included the handover of 43 members of the Azov Regiment, a National Guard unit that Russia says is a dangerous far-right battalion, a promising sign for Ukrainians hoping for the release of other fighters from the unit. And a former U.S. soldier captured while fighting in eastern Ukraine on the Ukrainian side says he hopes that not having fired a shot on the battlefield would be considered when separatist authorities determine his fate. In a video interview with Russia's RI state news agency, Alexander Druk said his fighting experience in Ukraine was limited to the day he was captured outside Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. Mr. Druk and fellow American Andy Hearn went missing this month. Russian state media later showed video interviews with the pair saying they had been captured by Russian-backed forces. The Kremlin has said it cannot rule out that the two captured men, both from Alabama, would be sentenced to death if put on trial in a region held by Russian proxies who have held large swaths of territory since 2014.
Getting in the news in America, and it seemed like a lot of Ukrainians needed help. It seemed like they were fleeing their homes, at least that's what we were being shown. And so I made the choice to come over and see if that's what was happening and if I could help in any way. I came not realizing that I didn't have the full scope of the information, and if I had a better idea of what was actually happening here, I would not have come. So yes, I do regret coming. I want to say that while we were in a training environment, it was the equivalent of about $1,000 a month. And then if we deployed to the front with them, it was going to be somewhere around $3,500 a month. They gave me money for while I was training there. The other two contracts, there was a verbal agreement that we would receive payment, but I've never received payment to my knowledge.
When February 24th started, there was a lot of news, and in hindsight now, I now see it as propaganda because they don't tell you the whole truth. That basically the Russian people were indiscriminately killing people. Through my travels of Ukraine, I saw that that was not true.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says that NATO expansion to include Finland and Sweden was the opposite of what Russian leader Vladimir Putin had wanted. Russia, previously classed as a strategic partner of NATO, is now identified as NATO's main threat.
The long-standing position is that we don't think this is the right time to be doing constitutional change. We're focused on the priorities, which is tackling cost of living, the pressures that we all face, sorting out our economy, our plan for a stronger economy. And I would just say, repeat, I think our economy is all the stronger for being together. So a very important day in the sense that we're seeing expansion of the alliance, which is exactly the opposite of what Putin wanted. He wanted less NATO, he's getting more. But what we're also doing with the Eastern European countries, with the Baltics, is offering long-term support, partnership to help them build up their defences and make sure they can repel any attack immediately. What we're trying to do today here in NATO, in addition to everything else, is get our partners to recognise that everybody needs to step up to the plate. And they are. And you've seen the massive commitments by the Germans, increased expenditure around the time.
The lower house of Russia's parliament has approved the critical second reading of a proposed law that would allow the banning of foreign news media in response to other countries taking actions against Russian news outlets. The proposal must still pass a third reading in the Duma and secure the upper house's approval before going to the president to be signed into law. But the Duma's approval of the second reading, when a proposal can still undergo substantial changes, almost always prefigures a law's enactment. Russia has repeatedly complained in recent months that Western countries were improperly restricting Russian media by banning their operation or denying visas to their journalists. In early June, Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova called in representatives of American media, including the Associated Press, to warn that they could be denied renewal of their visas and accreditation. The draft law also calls for allowing Russia's Prosecutor General to cancel the registration of media outlets for disseminating illegal, dangerous, unreliable, publicly significant information or disinformation expressing clear disrespect for society, the state, the constitution of the Russian Federation, as well as aimed at discrediting the Russian armed forces. New Zealand's Prime Minister has condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, highlighted the importance of international rules, and warned against a new arms race. Jacinda Ardern said this in a speech at the NATO summit in Madrid, adding that NATO should stand firm on the rules-based order, calling for diplomatic engagement and speak out against human rights abuses at all times when and where they are seen. She also says that China has become more assertive and is more willing to challenge international rules and norms, and urged the use of diplomacy and economic links to build ties in the Indo-Pacific region. New Zealand is not a member of NATO, but it is a partner of the Western Defence Alliance, and on occasion, New Zealand troops have supported NATO-led operations. In recent months, it has contributed to the NATO Trust Fund for operations in Ukraine. China's permanent representative to the United Nations, Mr. Zhang Jun, has called for joint efforts of all sides to achieve a peaceful settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. At a UN Security Council meeting on the Ukrainian situation, Mr. Zhang pointed out that NATO is making trouble around the world and the obsolete Cold War script can't be staged again in the Asia-Pacific region. Noting that military tensions in Ukraine have lasted for over 4 months, Mr. Zhang said China had always independently made judgments on the basis of the historical context and the merits of the Ukrainian issue. Mr. Zhang also said all sides of the international community should work for an early settlement of the Ukrainian crisis in a responsible manner and create the necessary environment and conditions for peaceful negotiations between the parties concerned. Let's talk now to Professor Olufemi Saibu, the director of the Institute of Nigeria-China Development Studies at the University of Lagos. Good morning to you. Thank you for your time this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity.
Let's start off with something almost not directly related. The Chinese president is in Hong Kong at the moment for the first time in quite a while. And then for the first time, he's gone outside China since COVID-19 started. And he's there to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Hong Kong handover. Many people are saying that China has become more assertive on the international stage and is more willing to challenge the world order. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, the Chinese government over the years after they moved to the market economy, they have tried as much as possible to build strategic alliance across the globe. Today, the Chinese economy dominates Africa, also now trying to dominate Latin Americas and even other areas in Europe. With this positioning, I think Chinese now have seen themselves as at least a force to beat in the global economy and politics as well. And therefore, they have to become more assertive so that they will be respected. Before now, there's a way they were seen as maybe a poor country, a third world country. Now they feel that it is now people recognize their position in the global economy, and as well, they want to play that role and also become at least alternative voice to the Western voice that we are used to in the past.
Now, China, as you've just pointed out, of course, has become really, really big and has become economically successful. But that has been because of its relations with the Western countries, the EU, the US, and other such states. Do you think that a possible challenge to the international order that those states have put in place could signal that China itself is now seeking to take the throne, as it were, and dictate a new world order, which is not what is currently happening?
I think what China is trying to do is to look at the areas where the Western world have not been able to convince people that at least they protect their interests. And the South-side countries as well, for some times, they feel that they have been dominated unnecessarily, and the Chinese now decided to find a kind of a partnership that provide alternative to the Western world approach to them and build a kind of confidence with them and try to see how they can fill those gaps with the countries that actually they were only whipped in to the Western world, not necessarily they agree with what many of the Western countries' positions. Now the Chinese try now to provide that opportunity to feed that vacuum by providing alternatives to the Western ideology, and again showcase to them that if you can see what we have done with our own ideology, with our own approach, then they feel that it could be something that will be appealing to countries who do not believe in the current Western domination as well. And therefore, Chinese is not necessarily that they want to challenge the Western world, but they are trying to provide alternatives for those countries who feel that they are not comfortable with the Western ideology, especially when it comes to the economics and politics.
Let's come to Ukraine, the current crisis, the war in Ukraine. Russia would appear to be isolated by the West, but there is no doubt that the Chinese have sought to be a balancing factor in all of this by calling continuously for both sides to look at things a bit more carefully and for there to be diplomacy and peace. There are no obvious support for Russia, but it is obvious that the Chinese are backing Russia. So that brings up the question of alternative sources of authority in the world order, which is what we just finished talking about, which is where you have someone saying, look, there's not just one narrative, there's more than one narrative, and Ukraine is a good example of that. Do you think we're going to have more and more of that, particularly with the role that we have just described as China having in Ukraine?
Yes, I think the Ukraine crisis provide opportunities for countries that they had issues with the US and then the Western world as well. And for long, the Russia and then the China, they have been in partnership. and they have been the alternative voices against the West and in the US. So this one give them an opportunity to be able to realign their relationship and find areas where they can work together to confront the West. Because if the Russia fail with Ukraine, then the China again know very well that they may fail with Taiwan and Hong Kong in the nearest future. So the partnership between China and Russia now really is just Chinese trying to use it as a way to send a message to the world that they should not try that again with them in Taiwan, and they also want to do the same thing. And again, Russia is trying as well to use the opportunity to tell them there's not only one alternative to things in the world, that also other people also have interest to protect, and therefore they also have to stand and protect themselves. And they are looking at China as a good partner in this aspect, so that one, today is Russia, tomorrow it will be China, and therefore they are building kind of opportunity to build a new order that can challenge the status quo. And also, from an economic perspective, the Ukraine crisis provides economic opportunity for some countries who had suffered greatly during the COVID-19. And they now look at opportunity again to be able to get into the market and below the competitive price and get things that are very expensive in the past. And therefore, China is taking this advantage very well. And similarly, like India as well, taking advantage of this to get those things that are very expensive before they get. And rather than losing during the crisis, they are getting better advantage over the others as well. So it's both economic and political.
How do you see all of this panning out? You've mentioned the fact that China is sending out a warning, especially with reference to Taiwan, with the issue of spheres of influence. And China isn't Russia, is it? In the sense that China is a much bigger country. It has a lot more people. Its economic power is several multiples of Russia, and therefore it will be a much more daunting foe to take on if that were to become the situation. But do you see a situation where the West, the kind of support that they've given to Ukraine against Russia, could come up with that kind of support if the Russians were replaced by the Chinese?
Yeah, that's the message that Russia is trying to send to them, that if they do not support the Russia now, when they are now ganging up against Russia now, when the time comes for their whole to also take some of assertive action against Taiwan or Hong Kong, that the West will be able to build alliances even beyond the Euro and come to Asian countries and begin to form alliances that may affect the interests of China. That if the West and the US to do this with Russia, despite the kind of relationship, strategic partnership they have, then again, they can do the same thing to China as well. And it's better for them to take some proactive action and again, preemptive measure to ensure that the West and the US do not again think that they could also adopt the same strategy. So it's a way of sending signal that the US again may think ahead and say, okay, the China could be bigger and then could have more international appeal than Russia, but if they achieve their aims in Ukraine, then again Taiwan could be the next alternative as well. They could also pursue, and so China is trying to give that a position that don't try this us with us, and we have to support our friend. And as well, it's the best time to show that we are friends of Russia.
Let's end this on the African continent and talk about what you talked about in the answer to the first question when you said that China is also becoming or has also become a very large player economically and politically on the African continent. Do you think that because Africa is also a playing ground for the Western powers as well, the British, the French, the Americans, they're also very, very strong. Their footprint is large on the ground in Africa. Do you think that China is providing a real viable alternative for many of these African countries in terms of economic support, political example, general alternatives, even in terms of economic levers to what they had been traditionally used to?
But if you place the Western model and the Chinese model side by side, if you want to be very fair to Chinese, I think their model appeal more to African countries. Yes, we want to also identify some areas where at least there are some traps that were placed in it as well. But by the time you look at the experiences of Africa in terms of maybe relating with the West in the past, they had really not have so much to show for it. And now for the Chinese model, whereby at least the Chinese allow the African countries a little bit of freedom in their political system. They allow them to have some ways they organize themselves culturally and socially. They do not want to come into areas that is not really directly affecting China. Whereas the Western model, they want to get hold of the whole of the African mindset, social values, and everything. So as a result of that, the African leaders see the Chinese model as a little bit flexible and give them some element of control, and therefore is a little bit at least appealing to them than the Western world. Yes, it could have some areas where they have concern as well, but they feel that at least is a better alternative than what they have before. So, and I explain why you see many of African countries at least preferring to go with China than going with the West they are used to as well. And I think it's a little bit better.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Professor Olufemi Saibu, Director, Institute of Nigeria-China Development Studies at the University of Lagos. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Still to come, NATO leaders give standing ovation for Kiev Orchestra during summit performance. Please stay on with us. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova says Moscow is not in diplomatic contact with Canada and Germany over repairs to a turbine, which Moscow has cited as its reason for cutting gas flows to Europe via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. Russia's state-controlled Gazprom this month cut flows to 40% of usual levels, citing the delayed return of equipment being serviced by Germany's Siemens Energy in Canada. And the Russian-installed ambassador to Moscow from the so-called Luhansk People's Republic has said that Russian forces with local separatists have taken full control of the Lysychansk oil refinery. RIA News reports that the territory of the largest oil refinery in Ukraine has completely come under the control of those troops. Russia's defense ministry has said yesterday that its forces had defeated a battalion of Ukrainian troops near the oil refinery. And the International Energy Agency's chief executive, Faith Birol, says the European Union will need to cut as much as 30% of its gas use by mid-February next year if flows from Russia are halted. The IEA chief notes that lowering consumption should first start with industry usage and households to reach storage goals. Europe's largest economy, Germany, has been struggling with a shortfall in Russian gas supplies after deliveries via the Nord Stream pipeline were cut by 60% earlier on this month. In response, the governments have launched the alarm phase of its gas emergency plan, signaling that businesses and households need to cut down on consumption. Let's talk to Ini John McQuarrie, as we usually do at this time. Ini, morning.
Good morning.
There does seem to be quite a lot to unpack here. Let's start off for the issue of the price cap. I know we talked about that a bit earlier on.
Yes.
And how much of an impact is that having? How far have they gone with those discussions?
Well, obviously not so far, because even when they finished the G7 meeting, they were not able to reach how it's going to work, the modalities and all that, because it's kind of really difficult. You have countries like India and China who are using this opportunity. You know, for instance, oil this morning is about 115 naira for $1, and then they're getting it for about $70 and stocking all their reserves, you know, and all of that. And then you want to put a price cap, and yet Russia is on the sanctions. So how do you control that? So the U.S. has been going out to speak to, especially India, to see if they can co-opt them into that. But I mean, I think even they are finding it difficult to fathom how it's going to work. How are you going to force India, which is looking at self-sustenance, you know, make them say
drop that and then
exactly,
come to your side,
and come to you, and make Russia, who have their oil and control it. I mean, you've shut down and frozen their assets and their money, and then you're saying that, oh, the crude that they have from their own country, they can't deal with it. You know, it's going to be kind of difficult for the EU, and I think that's why they have not been able to reach the modalities of how this is going to work. And you know, you have countries like Pakistan. They are ready. I mean, they are not friendly countries to the US and all of that. They are ready to even purchase this crude from Russia. But of course, they have the sanctions, which is a big hurdle for them of how to pay, how to go about it. They are working on doing a government-to-government, a G-to-G arrangement. But you know,
all these things take time, really.
They take time, and then it's a system, it's a global system. If you want to do shipping, for instance, so while Russia is trying to block Ukraine from using the Black Sea, it's also blocking other countries,
from
also blocking
the same facilities.
Exactly. So it's a global world, fortunately or unfortunately. So it's going to be kind of difficult for them to get a way to implement this price cap they've been working on.
Let's bring it a bit closer to home. I read some scary statistic day before yesterday, I think it was, to say that foreign direct investment to Nigeria's energy sector had dropped to almost zero in the first half.
First half, yeah, because today is the last day of the first half
of the year. And I'm now seeing that global investment has also dropped.
Yeah, everything has dropped. In fact, I have to do this. I have to get the figures out. You know, so last year, which was 2021, global financial wealth reached a record high at $530 trillion. And then for this year, year on year, now we see that IPOs, that's initial public offers, when you talk about capital markets, raising of equities for companies, has dropped by 94%, actually. Yes, it is.
94%.
Yes, I mean, we've been talking about, you know, how the equities around the world have dropped. So this is it. Investors do not have the thirst or the desire to go into this, because what are you going there for? Some of us were talking about if you had saved your money in the bank and you thought, for instance, you had 300,000, you converted to $1 at the beginning of the year, and then you do the same conversion at this time, you would almost, you have a heartache.
Yes, because you've lost significant amounts.
Exactly. So it's the same thing. You bought a share for 100 naira, and then you have the projection, because the company is very viable and doing so well, that by the end of the year, it's going to be maybe 150, and you have investment plans, or you do have plans, so you want to sell it off at the end of the year, and then suddenly it's costing 15 naira. You won't want to go there. You will look for a hedge. Maybe it's the dollar and gold, now that they're aiming for gold, because some people used to go for gold as a hedge, you know, if it's going to happen. You know, and it's also changing. I heard you discuss with your last guest about changing the new face of what's going on in the world now. It's also changing. So the US and the UK, most of the West, used to control, I think, about 70% of IPOs. But in the last one, for the first half of the year, I think for the first quarter, I beg your pardon, the first quarter of the year, the top 10 companies are now the Chinese companies. So all the war and the consequences and the sanctions is changing global face of, you know, world order. I think that.
And how how this unfolds, and of course, further complications are being introduced by Russia's attempt to circumvent the sanctions it is under.
Obviously.
I see that they're gathering African leaders, regional economic blocs,
Russia-Africa summits.
Yes, so
we talked about BRICS yesterday, remember?
Indeed.
We talked about BRICS.
They're not sitting idle.
No, they weren't. I don't think any normal person will sit idle. Everybody will look, because you're alive, your country is still existing. You have to find ways. You have to look for untapped areas to see if you can get it. And Africa seems to be one of that. This is the second summit. The first one was in 2019, but I don't think they took it that serious. And now they're taking it serious. They're supposed to hold around October, November in Addis Ababa, you know.
Absolutely.
And the first one had about 48 African countries. Now, I ask myself when I saw the story that how many African countries are going to, because I think this means coming out there to say, we don't really care what Russia is doing in Ukraine, you know, so we want to go ahead. It's actually called the Russia-Africa Summit. So there's no
ambiguity about it.
There's nothing about it. So that means you are in collaboration with Russia, you know. And guess what? You know, we're talking about Russia cheap oil. I think it's getting to a level where we also have Russia cheap equipment, cheap infrastructure. Because, I mean, some people are talking about Africa taking advantage of that at this time. Because it's one area that, you know, Africans, we don't produce all those high-tech stuff, unfortunately. So,
don't get me started. Don't get me started. Don't get me started on that. Thank you. We'll have, of course, more of this and all the other business stories. Ini and Laddie Williams will be unpacking all those for you right after this show, and then later on at 1:30 on Business Incorporated. See you later, Ini.
Thank you.
In the sport, Ukrainian player Leslia Surenko says she feels guilty after reaching Wimbledon's third round while there is war in her country. The 33-year-old says all she can do is keep playing and donating 10% of her prize money to help. On Wednesday, she beat compatriot Alelina Kalinina, who had earlier spoken of wanting to win more money to help rebuild her parents' home. Surenko wore a ribbon in the yellow and blue colors of the Ukrainian flag on her outfit after the All England club agreed to let her. Meanwhile, Kalinina is hoping to extend her stay in London by competing in the doubles event. The 25-year-old has not been home since the week before Russia invaded Ukraine and has no idea when she'll be able to return.
3-6, 6-4, 6-3.
Ukrainian boxer Alexander Usyk says he will be returning to Ukraine immediately after the rematch with Anthony Joshua and will not be pursuing an undisputed fight with WBC champion Tyson Fury if he wins the bout in Saudi Arabia on August the 20th. The Gypsy King had told TalkSport he would come out of retirement if paid $500 million. But for Usyk, his mind is focused on only one thing. Outside of his rematch with Joshua, his nation's war with Russia. Usyk previously revealed his house in Ukraine had been shot at when Russia invaded his homeland earlier this year, and he signed up quickly to fight, joining a local territorial defense force in Kiev. The current unified WBA, WBO, and IBF heavyweight champion also revealed that he is planning a special tribute to Ukraine during his ring walk for the rematch. And finally, Kiev's Symphony Orchestra performed at Madrid's Prado Museum during a dinner hosted by Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez. Leaders and officials, including Kiev Mayor Vitaly Klitschko, gave a standing ovation to the orchestra as they stood and listened to them play. Some orchestra members paid homage to their homeland by wearing Ukraine heart badges on their suit jackets and having Ukraine flags on their instruments. The orchestra, directed by Italian Luigi Guerriero and comprising of 90 members, left their places of origin to go on tour with the project Voice of Ukraine. Since April of 2022, they have performed in European concert halls, including the EL Philharmonie in Hamburg, the Berlin Philharmonic, and the Gewandhaus in Leipzig. All right, that's how we end the program this morning. Thanks for being with us. My name is Laddie Akiridoluali. There's an update later on in the world today at 5 o'clock. Do watch out for that. But for now, have yourselves a pleasant Thursday ahead.